Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so obviously we had a big game going on over the weekend, right? Obviously, we had the Boston Celtics and the Milwaukee Bucks, right? This was kind of a big game here because obviously this was Chris Middleton's first game back, right? Coming back from his ankle surgery in the offseason. Obviously, the Celtics had been rolling, as had the Milwaukee Bucks, right? And this was a back and forth game. The Boston Celtics did end up winning the game 105-111, but for a decent chunk of the game, Milwaukee was up, and I felt like this was the best that I've seen the Bucks play so far, even though they did lose. And I think, if you're the Bucks, you kind of hang your hat on, obviously Lillard and Giannis still played overall pretty well. You got some good quality minutes, from a couple other guys out there at different points, including AJ Green, even Garrett Trent. But in the end, right, in the fourth quarter, right, Jason Tatum of the Boston Celtics kind of led the Celtics home, basically took the game over. And, I mean, it was pretty much a sight to see, right? He had 34 and 10, 5 assists, 4 of 10 from 3, including a number of big buckets in the fourth quarter, key rebounds, key passes, everything you want to see. Al Horford, right, obviously starting in place of Porzingis, who didn't play in that game, had the Giannis assignment at different points, did a really good job in the fourth. Drew Holiday had a big game, even hit the dagger shot. Peyton Pritchard off the bench, right? Just, he didn't have a good game in this one. He had 0 points, but Sam Hauser kind of made up for it. So, there's a lot to like from this Celtics team. And they did lose the game after that. It was a back-to-back against the Memphis Grizzlies. But it was also their 5th game in 7 nights. So, they were kind of on a stretch where I think you could tell they were a little bit fatigued. But when you watch the Boston Celtics play, they look better than last year, at least so far. I mean, you look at the record, they're 19-5, and you also kind of factor in that they've also had more injuries, I think, than last season, at least to begin, right? Because Porzingis hasn't really played at all aside from a handful of games. There have been a few games, right, where other guys have been in and out, right? Like there were a couple of games, I think, where Jaylen Brown didn't play, right? A couple of games Derek White was out. I think even a couple of games that Tatum missed. But by and large, a lot of guys on this roster look better, including their best player, Jason Tatum, which I think, you obviously start there where he's your superstar. He's the guy that, a lot of people kind of question, like, is this guy really a top 5 player? But this season, he is, certainly living up to the case that he's one of the best players, 5 best players in the NBA. And again, like even a guy like a Peyton Pritchard, right, where I think, when we did our 6th man of the year, when we did our season awards right before the season started, we didn't even really think about him at all, right? Like we kind of talked about like the guys that had been, kind of the consistent award winners, including guys like Naz Reid or say like a Malik Monk and others, right? But we didn't consider Peyton Pritchard. But this guy has been having quite absolutely a psychotic season off the bench, but in a good way, obviously. He's averaging 16 a game, 3 rebounds, 3 assists. All of his averages are way up from last season when he averaged just under 10. And he's shooting 49 from the field, 43% from 3 on just under 9 attempts a game. So that's giving them like a real just like insane bench piece. And that's part of why the team looks deeper. Hauser actually, had a down year shooting from 3, but Pritchard's kind of made up for that. And, each night they kind of decide which bigs to play because there's some nights where you'll see like a Luke Cornett, other nights where you'll see like a Neemias Queta, maybe some other nights where it's Xavier Tillman, I guess, if it's kind of like a smaller team that you're playing against. So they're kind of hitting on all cylinders. And they still kind of feel like that they're the team to beat in the NBA. Like when you watch them play, we've talked about their style of play and why it's such a, absolutely menacing, devastating style of play just because of the fact that, they get the threes up at a high volume and they make them at a high volume. But it's not just that. They also generate a ton of high quality shots and they can defend as well. And with Porzingis, you have the added factor of the size and length. So who's stopping them at this point? Obviously, like they don't have the best record in the East. The Cavs are still there, so it looks like the Cavs might have kind of claimed the spot after Boston, right? As like the team, if it's not Boston, who is it? Even though the Bucks are playing better, right? Philly kind of looms towards the bottom, right? But Embiid is back. He played earlier today, and still look kind of rusty, but by and large he was moving better. But we'll see. Obviously, the Knicks, right? They're still kind of, they're doing pretty well, 7-3 in their last 10. The Magic, unfortunately, had a big injury. We'll talk about that later on. But what are you seeing from the Celtics that's kind of making you feel a certain way about the team, or are you not feeling any different about them?
Um, like you said, they just haven't really lost a step. Coming off the chip from last year. Everybody's playing at an elite level. I think it's a trickle down effect. Jason Tatum plays well. Obviously, the other guys are gonna as well. Jaylen Brown also, I think, has been somewhat underrated as well defensively and what he's been able to do. I've seen like viral clips of the way that he's kind of been pestering, players and stuff like that. People are saying it's hand checking. I'm all in favor for it. So he's been a menace on the defensive end and obviously picking up a little bit offensively as well. Like you said, Peyton Pritchard being a solid bench piece definitely helps because he was solid last year, but if you get a better version of him this year, then I would assume that they're gonna win the championship again because their depth is sneaky underrated. A lot of people look at the team, they're like, "Oh my gosh, the top end talent is crazy," and then you look at the bench, and then you're like, "Who are these randoms?" No, 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 no. That's not the case. These guys are
Right.
ballers. All of them have a specific role, and yeah, they've all fit into it seamlessly. And like I said, the chemistry seems to be at an all-time high as well. That's another thing that's
Mhm.
really cool. They trust each other, and everybody knows what their job is, and yeah, they can clearly get it done. So and I think Jason Tatum being an MVP candidate, a legit one this year, I think that also skyrockets the confidence of the whole team and the organization as a whole.
Yeah, and that's something that we kind of talked about that could be a variable for the Celtics, where if your best player takes another step forward, which because of his age, right? That's a pretty reasonable take, right? Because he's only 26 years old, right? So I
Yeah,
mean, you're essentially looking at a guy that is kind of just getting ready to enter, right, the peak state, the prime stages of his career, right? So
yeah,
he looks better. We are even a guy like a Derek White, right, who's already, at this point now 30, right? He's playing the best basketball of his career, right? Like,
hmm,
usually you would think, you know, not that he would be declining at all because it's not like 30 is old, but you would have thought like he would kind of already be in that mix. But just a lot to like about this team, which we talked about before many times, right? Like last year, obviously they had the benefit of playing through a number of teams that had injuries, but at the same time, they didn't have Porzingis. So, they can kind of hang their hat on that too. And even though they didn't really make any personnel moves, they were looking at internal development, and that's kind of what they've gotten from a number of these guys. So I mean, this team looks pretty scary, right? I know we've kind of had a stretch where each time the last champion won, I think a lot of people made a case for why that team could win again, right? Going all the way back to not so much the Raptors because obviously Kawhi left, but going all the way back to say like the Lakers title in 2020 and all the champions, after that. People generally made a decent case, but they look like they have the best case now, right? Because I mean, like nothing about their team really feels manufactured, like from the perspective of like, you're no longer questioning like, are they actually really this good? Like clearly they are, right? Because again, the record is about the same as last season with circumstances that are a little bit tougher because of the injuries. So that's where I think, anybody who didn't feel like this team was legit, which wasn't us, but anybody who felt like it, now you kind of have to kind of give it to them like, nah, like this looks like it's the best team in the NBA, even though they don't have the best record. It's just a matter of is there anybody that can realistically stop them if they're fully healthy? And I think that's kind of the question where we'll have to kind of see. Because obviously, with the East, there are some teams that will look to challenge them. And, we've talked about which teams probably, those are right now, right? Because, say, like going in, we thought, okay, Philly, Milwaukee, New York, right? But for Philly, obviously, they've had so many injuries and they've struggled. We'll see if they can get back into the swing of things as we talked about. But what do you think of this? Like, is it just kind of feel like that this team is just kind of destined I know they weren't your pick to win the title, but so far through the first 25-ish games of the season, for them, does it kind of look like they might just be destined to go back to back, assuming that they're at full strength?
yeah. They look the freaking part, and it's crazy because on both ends of the floor, they've gotten better, which I don't know how that's even possible, honestly. But yeah, as a collective unit, it's scary. Like my pick was the Knicks, but defensively they haven't been amazing. Offensively, they've been awesome to watch, and seeing all the guys
Yo,
run that 5-out offense. But when it comes to the defense, I just think they're probably going to get overwhelmed by Boston and what they can do, and how many sets they can run and all the plays that they can call. I think they'll kind of just exploit New York's weaknesses. Although New York isn't fully healthy either, but yeah, Boston's pretty much been playing the majority of the season without Porzingis, and they look the same, if not better, than last year. So
mm,
that's also the other factor. Like come postseason and Porzingis is fully healthy, then yeah, I think the title is a
mm.
100% guaranteed lock.
Yeah, how do you feel about the Bucks, right? Because say
Okay.
like they played the Celtics, the other night, and even though they did lose, they did look competitive against them, and obviously that's with Chris Middleton, just coming back from injury. Do you feel like that there's another level the Bucks could reach where like they could get to, a situation where they could upset the Celtics, or is it just kind of destined to? It probably is a lost cause because they may just not have the personnel to be able to slow down some of the guys on the Celtics. Team offensively.
Yeah, I think they would need injury luck, to be honest. I think that would be the only thing that could potentially save them and get them past Boston if and
Mm,
when they do meet up in the playoffs, because from what I've seen in the regular season, it's kind of the same thing every night. Giannis and Dame are kind of going off, or it's just Giannis going off, and then the other guys are kind of trying to fill in the roles, but it's just still not enough. Like if you look at what Boston's able to do, they can have three guys who are in the double digits and stuff like that, maybe like 4, 5, 6 at times, and sometimes you can have like three of them that are 20-point scorers. So that's the difference. Like Milwaukee, I feel like you're kind of just hoping and praying that some of these guys show up on the offensive end. Maybe if Chris Middleton looks a little bit better down the line and as the season goes on, maybe. But even then, I just don't think that they have the defensive personnel to really stop those wing guys, because if Milwaukee's going to try and wall up in the paint or take guys off the perimeter, then I feel like other guys on Boston are going to clearly step up, like Peyton Pritchard. What do you do with a guy like him? Drew Holiday, Derek White. Those are all people that you have to be, accounting for on the defensive end, and I just don't think they have the personnel, and that's without Porzingis. So
yeah, and that's kind of the tough part there in terms of the matchups. I mean, and again, like for Milwaukee, I think they would probably also need to make some personnel upgrades as well, right?
yeah,
And I think that they'll be active. I don't necessarily know how successful they're going to be at it, but clearly we know that they're going to be looking for some extra pieces. At because there's a couple of, like say like a Pat Connaughton doesn't play anymore, so that could be a guy that they might try to dump and I don't know attack to second or something. I mean, they kind of have limited assets to work with, which is kind of the tough part. But I mean, it's kind of funny because in the 3 games that they've played against the Celtics, right? Like the theme has kind of been in the first half, the Bucks play well and kind of match the Celtics, or in some cases outplay them, and then in the second half, usually by the fourth quarter, the Celtics kind of just pull away. This was the first one where it looked like a 50-50 game, but of course no Porzingis. I mean, Lillard against the Celtics has averaged 26, 5 and 6, not really shooting well though, but I think one of those games, that was the second matchup, I think, where he ended up having the concussion after the game, right? And I
yeah.
think that was the game where he just played really poorly. So that probably kind of skews the stats a little bit. Such a small sample size. But, in the games that they played, it feels like Giannis and Lillard overall have played, pretty well against the Celtics. But, it kind of comes down to the supporting cast because we know the Celtics supporting cast already is pretty reliable on both ends of the floor, but we're just kind of waiting to see which guys in terms of the supporting cast for Milwaukee, right, kind of come out to play. Because say, Torian Prince, I think only played like what 9 minutes in the Celtics game, right? And I don't think he really did anything. I don't really recall because I didn't catch the first opening stretch of the game, so I'm not sure if he got hurt or if he, kind of came out of the game because I think he's been questionable recently with an illness. But and then obviously they tried to get Middleton in there for 23-ish minutes or so. So I mean, I think with the roster as currently constructed, I don't think they'd be able to pull it off. I think they would have to make some personnel moves. And even then, I think I'm kind of with you where I think they would still need a little bit of some fortune to go their way in order to beat them 4 out of 7 times. Because that's the tough part. It's not like football where it's just one win. It's not like the play in where it's just one win and you beat a team, right? You have to beat them 4 out of 7 times. And obviously, if you're the Celtics, right, you're gonna have home court, at least through the first 2 rounds, right? Because they're gonna probably stay, you know, either at the 2 seed or maybe move up to 1 if Cleveland loses a couple of games here and there. I'm not sure, but those 2 teams are pretty much locked in for home court. So that's going to be the tough part in terms of also pulling off the upset because you're going to have to do it on the road too.
Yeah, it should be interesting.
Yeah, and with the Celtics roster, like their roster's probably set, and like I don't really expect them to really make any moves. Maybe they make a minor one, to kind of bring in some rotational guy that could be like the 11th guy or something out there, but
Hmm.
they kind of already have that. So I don't really anticipate that they're really going to do anything. But they don't really need to, right? Like their roster needs are not quite as pressing as Milwaukee's, right? Because like Boston, I mean, they've only lost 5 games, right? Milwaukee's been on a really good stretch recently, so it is good to see that Milwaukee's playing better. But even so, it still feels like Boston's the team to beat. But I did want, I thought it was an important matchup because I think it was good to see, where the Bucks at. Whether or not the way they were playing was kind of just a little bit fluky, that it was against bad teams, or was there actual improvement? It felt like there was legitimate improvement there, even
Yeah,
though they didn't get the final result they wanted.
yeah.
So now we're gonna go on. We're gonna stick in the Eastern Conference. We're gonna move on to the Atlanta Hawks. Who've won 6 games in a row, and they look pretty solid. Obviously, they're 13-11, so the record doesn't necessarily kind of you know sound like it's super impressive. But you look at the teams that they've beaten in the stretch. 2 wins over the Cleveland Cavaliers, right, who have the best record in the NBA. I'd say that's pretty impressive. One of those was a cup game, right? So that was a game where both teams wanted to win. Um, and then a win over Charlotte, right? Not super impressive, obviously, because it's the shorthanded Charlotte Hornets, but still, a win is a win. A win over the Pelicans, okay, kind of a similar thing there. But a win over the Bucks, right? Who, despite their record, they've been playing very well as of late. And a win over the Lakers, who have not been playing well as of late. But obviously, regardless, it was still a hard fought win into overtime. Lots of funny plays in that game, but for sure. And it's kind of funny because in a number of those games, Trae Young didn't have his best performances. Now, obviously, against the Lakers, right, he had, 38 points, 20 assists or whatever. But in some of these other games, if we talk about, some of his shooting splits, like say against the Milwaukee Bucks, shot 6 for 19, right, which is, not generally speaking what you normally expect from him.
Hmm.
Against the New Orleans Pelicans, he shot 5 for 16, right? And then, against the Charlotte Hornets, right, we look at that, and then you see his shooting splits there, 4 of 9, right? So not bad shooting splits there, just not a lot of shots taken, right? But that hasn't really been the focal point for him, right? He's kind of been looking to get a lot of these guys involved, right? In one of the Cleveland games, that was the game where he had like 20 assists or whatever.
Hmm.
So you're talking about basically 2 games where he had 20 assists,
Yes.
which doesn't really happen a lot. Spoiler alert, right? So I mean, yeah, it was the 2020 game. He had 20 points, 20 assists. So a
Hmm.
lot to like. Now they're getting blown out right now by the Denver Nuggets as we're talking in the second quarter. We'll see, if they bounce back there or if the streak ends. But they've played some really good basketball as of late, and it's kind of gone under the radar, right? Because I think going into the season, most people, ourselves included, didn't really expect much from this Hawks team, right? They moved on from DeJounte Murray and didn't really get, you know, or it wasn't perceived that they got a whole lot back, even though they ended up getting back Dyson Daniels, who's been a big part of this team's run. And then obviously they got the Lakers pick for 2025, so at the end of this season. So obviously they have a pretty special interest in terms of the Lakers being as horrible as possible. And then obviously they took Reese Shea, number 1 overall, right? Obviously in a typical draft, not a guy that you would expect to go number 1. But you look at his numbers, and overall, he's played relatively well. The shooting splits don't really look that good, but he's kind of fit in as like a pretty workable piece in terms of like easy to just plug and play. And they have a really good setup where it's a lot of length and a lot of size and athletes around Trae Young, a lot of wing size players, a lot of solid wing players, right? Like Jalen Johnson, who we hadn't mentioned yet, right? He's had a really good season thus far, averaging 20 points, 10 rebounds, 5.5 assists. So a lot to like there, right? Looking like a pretty well improved player. DeAndre Hunter comes off the bench, right, as a solid backup wing. You still have a Kungwu and Clint Capella kind of splitting minutes back and forth, right? Usually Capella starts, but Okongwu tends to play more minutes usually. Then you have Bogdanovich, right? Bogdanovich coming off the bench. So there's a lot to like, right? And it's kind of surprising because, again, just going to be honest, we both, I'm pretty sure, were in terms of the under on this team, right? So, like, I think it was around 30 wins or so. I don't think we were super high on this team because I just don't think we liked, um, where it seemed like this team was going. But, I got to be honest, they've been really impressive so far. And I think, I'm curious to see where it goes, right? Just from the perspective of I don't actually know what they're going to look like by the end of the season. But, again, I think, there's something to work with here, right? Obviously, again, if you look at their offense and defensive ratings, they're not really too stellar right now. And that's because of the fact that before the 6 game win streak, they weren't playing very well. So that's part of what's kind of skewed it. But if we want to talk about essentially the last 6 games, right? So you can actually kind of go on that streak. They've been ninth in offensive rating and then fourth in defensive rating. So, that'll kind of get it done in terms of the win streak. Like I said, I'm not really sure what the ceiling of this team will be, but it seems like that they're going to be better than I think what we anticipated. They're fifth in the East right now, and of course they're in that kind of block after the top 4, right, where all those teams are kind of jumbled together by a few games, right? So, like, say the Sixers are 12th, they're 13 games back. The Hawks are 5th, they're 8 games back. So that's 5 games, so that's a decent difference at this point in the season. And like I said, some of these numbers will probably change. Like Brooklyn's 8 right now. Will that stay? Probably not, assuming that they make moves. So, what do you think that you like in terms of what you've seen from the Hawks right now? Because I think, again, it's kind of an identity that feels like it's similar to what they had, when they went to the Eastern Conference Finals, when you had like a number of lengthy athletic guys alongside Trae Young. Obviously, it's a different mix. Like, say, I think before that point, you had John Collins, right? He was a Hawk at that point, right? DeAndre Hunter was a starter, right? So the roster and the makeup was relatively different, but they've seemingly found a new formula next to them. And again, there are some of these games where they can get away with, you know, subpar offensive performances from him. And again, I think he's been playing through an Achilles thing. So that's partly why I think some of those numbers have been so up and down. But just by and large, it's been pretty good to see. Trae Young, going back to being on a winning team again, right? Because now I think over the last few seasons, he's kind of caught the reputation again of being kind of like a guy that doesn't really impact winning. But now they've got seemingly a mixture of guys around him that now makes more sense, given his strengths and weaknesses as a player, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, his passing, playmaking, to go along with that. So,
Yeah, the thing that I've really been thoroughly impressed with is, like you said, Trey Young. Really, that's the number one thing because I think, his efficiency has taken a dip. We all can acknowledge that. We all know that it has taken a dip this season. But I'm 100% okay with that if he's willing to, sacrifice, trying to shoot his way back into games to get other guys open. And that's kind of what their philosophy is for sure. Because you look at all the guys around him are having some great seasons, like Jalen Johnson, DeAndre Hunter, even Reese Share. I think his intangibles have been something that's very slept on. His off-ball movement, off-ball defense, and even his ability to just get open, I think, has been really awesome to watch. Um,
hmm
then obviously Dyson Daniels. That's the other piece where it's like this guy
yeah.
is all NBA defense right now. So he's been playing out of his mind, and sometimes all it takes is a little bit of a change of scenery. But I'm
hmm
glad that I think the Hawks have kind of quieted that noise of, is Trae Young the franchise player? Because I think he is, as long as you continue to put solid talent around him like this, length guys to mask, what he lacks on the defensive end, and makes him look better and makes everybody else look better, because that's what he is at the end of the day. He's a playmaker. We know what he can do with the ball in his hands. And yeah, I've just been really thoroughly impressed with how this team has looked as a unit. Shout out to the coaching as well, because I think that was another thing. They kind of switched things up slightly, a little bit than last year. Granted, that's because you do have different personnel, so now you don't have DeJounte Murray kind of taking away from what Trae Young does with the ball in his hands.
And that's Dyson Daniels. That's the other kind of wild piece of this, right? Because as of right now, I believe he's, leading the league in steals,
Yeah,
right?
he
At
is.
just over three a game, just under a block. Still can't really shoot the three, right? Unfortunately, right? A little under 30%. But again, rebounds, play makes, obviously defends, and, he's playing kind of like, this is the reason why he was kind of a guy that a lot of people were high on, back in the draft. And, I'll give you credit, you included, right?
Yeah,
I remember us talking about, back then, like, that was a guy that you liked, for New Orleans. And,
yeah.
he didn't really get a lot of playing time early on because their team was so deep.
And
But,
offensively, he hadn't put it together. Still really
right.
hasn't,
But
but
exactly. And that was kind of, I guess, one of the reasons why he was probably, when they were healthy, not really playing as much.
hmm
But, like you said, sometimes it's a change of scenery. And, now, right, you kind of look at the New Orleans situation and, right now Atlanta seemingly kind of got the best of the trade, right? Where I
yeah,
think the general consensus was that New Orleans won the trade, obviously because of the talent upgrade, right, with DeJounte Murray. But and like, part of it's not really his fault, right? It's more so like the team's been a mess because they've had horrible, luck in terms of injuries. But as of right now, I mean, that Dyson Daniels piece, I mean, is just kind of wild just because of the fact that he's been so good, especially on the defensive end, and it was exactly what Atlanta needed, right? And that's what they thought they were going to get with DeJounte Murray, right?
right,
Was
right.
kind of like, a guard that can defend and kind of take some of the pressure off of Trae Young, offensively as well, right, on both ends of the floor, because then you can have him guard the other team's best guards, right, and then he can also be a ball handler, playmaker, scorer. But it didn't really work out like that. But to Atlanta's credit, they recognized that it wasn't working, and then they traded him, and they got back a piece that kind of makes it worth it. Where it's like, and that's sometimes like kind of the wild part in terms of like these front office and ownership decisions is that sometimes the decisions that they make can be kind of dumb, but sometimes they're able to kind of bounce back and find a way out of it, right? Because it was looking kind of rough, for the Hawks, where we were, well, because initially at one point the discussion was they got to choose between Trae Young or DeJounte Murray, right? And we weren't, and it wasn't necessarily obvious which one they were going to choose, because I think the thought process was teams valued DeJounte Murray more than Trae Young,
hmm
even though I think most people recognize Trae Young is the better player.
hmm
So, and that was kind of the wild thing there. Now, with Murray, the other part is he's also barely played because, in the very first game for the Pelicans, right, he broke his hand basically, right? And I think he just came back recently, but of course, now by the time he's back, everyone else for New Orleans is gone and they have yet to play a single game together, right? Those three guys, right? Murray, Ingram, and Zion. So
Yeah,
that's kind of the rough part there, but just overall, just and also the nickname, the Great Barrier Thief. I gotta be
yeah.
honest, that's a nickname that I hadn't heard. I think up until this season, I guess it's a new one, and it's one of the best nicknames I can think of,
Facts.
especially in recent memory,
Yeah.
just because of the fact that again, if you didn't know, he's from Australia, obviously, and then Great Barrier Reef, we know what that is.
Yep.
So again, it's a pretty good one, and just shout out to Dyson Daniels for the play, that he's been able to pull off so far this season. Just
Yeah.
because, I mean, he had a stretch where it was like what, like 20 steals through 4 or 5 games. I
Yep.
mean that was a
Unheard
little
of.
earlier. Yeah, exactly. But still, like I mean, that's just insane. And again, I saw him, the other night against the Lakers, and offensively, he didn't do a whole lot until late in the game, where he kind of was able to get some floaters going. But just in general, it's just kind of wild to see, the progression. And again, age wise, he's still a very young guy, right? I mean, he's what, 21 years of
Yeah,
age
this is
right
his
now.
third
So I mean, he's
season.
still exactly. So he still has plenty of room to grow. And he's kind of showing like not all the G League Ignite guys, you know, are horrible.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
not saying they are anyways, right? But like, I think with the G League Ignite stuff kind of falling apart, and some of the guys that were drafted a little bit higher, like not being quite as consistent just yet, right? Like a Jalen Green and whatnot. Not saying he's a bad player or anything, but like just in general, just
Haven't
kind of
lived up
wild,
to the
right?
hype.
Yeah, like, and I don't think Daniels really had quite as much hype as some of these other, even
No.
though he was the eighth pick, right? He was kind of a relative unknown, I think. People saw him in G League Ignite, but I don't, it didn't really seem like there was a whole lot of thought that like he was going to be really, really, really good. I think some people looked at him more as like a point guard, right? But he's kind of, played the off guard a little bit with some playmaking chops, for Atlanta. So, they're set. you do kind of wonder if they ever actually move Trae Young, like would how would all these pieces still look? But just in general, like you don't really have to worry about that right now because I mean they've been winning, and I think they have an incentive to not just be horrible in these games, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, right, obviously they still have that situation going on in the draft, right, where some of their picks are going to be going to the San Antonio Spurs. So
Hmm.
that's kind of the other factor that you have to think about as well, because they're not, they can't necessarily just completely put everything in the tank, right?
Yeah.
Like, because if we're talking about their future picks, they don't have their pick this season. Like they have the Lakers, so obviously they're investing in that, and then they have the Sacramento Kings pick, although I believe it is protected, top 12 protected. So, if like so I guess like, if the Kings, have a bad year, I guess they would get their pick back, right? But, if they're like outside of the lottery, I guess then, the Kings would keep it.
Hmm.
Or it would go to the Hawks, excuse me. And then they don't have it in 2026 either. So, they're in kind of a weird spot right now. So, they don't really have a reason to just lose games. So, props to them for being able to figure that out.
Yeah. I didn't think they would have a winning formula this year.
Yeah. Now we're moving on. Now we're heading to the Western Conference. And kind of just splitting a couple of teams in half. And we'll look at the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves, right? These two teams right now are on the longest win streaks in the Western Conference right now. The Dallas Mavericks have won 7 in a row. The Minnesota Timberwolves have won 4 in a row right after the Anthony Edwards situation, right, where he called out his team. We'll look at the Mavericks first, right? Obviously, they were kind of starting this stretch of wins, right, without Luka, right? If you look at their last several games, they are 9-1 in their last 10, right? And even before that, right? Like, I mean, they were winning most of the games before that. They had a really tough start to the season, right? Obviously, where they weren't playing well. There were some front court guys that were kind of in and out of the lineup. And then obviously, once Luka was out with the injury, because he wasn't playing great offensively. I mean, obviously, he wasn't playing great defensively, but the offense wasn't that amazing either. He was kind of inefficient. But, then, they kind of made a couple of changes, right? Lively was inserted into the starting lineup for Gafford, right? And then obviously, Kyrie was able to do his thing. Quentin Grimes was getting more minutes. So now it seems like the team has kind of figured out, what they are going forward in terms of, the minutes allocations and the rotations, and everything else. And then obviously now Luka's been playing better. He's been shooting the ball better since he's come back from his injury. Kyrie's continued to play very well. And a lot of the role players have started to kind of come along too. Like PJ Washington has had a really good season. I mean, obviously, didn't shoot great against the Toronto Raptors, but as a whole, right, like he's been rebounding the ball really well, like a career high in rebounds a game. He's generally been like a 5, 6 rebound a game guy. He's averaging over 8 rebounds a game this season. Also averaging over a block and a steal, 45 from the field, 36 from three. So you like to see that. Off the bench, Quentin Grimes has overall played pretty well, especially in this recent stretch, like right before Luka was coming back. Because there was a stretch where he was kind of the starting guard next to Kyrie while Luka was out, and he was generally giving them like over 20 a game, shooting the ball really well. So he's kind of played his way into the rotation. And then you kind of look around elsewhere. Najee Marshall's been sick, I think, recently, but prior to that, he was giving them a boost at that forward spot, both as a starter and off the bench, right? And his 3-point shot's been coming along better. Spencer Dinwiddie, right? He has kind of played his way into the rotation, and he's given them some big possessions at different points. So, now you look at where the team is compared to where they were earlier in the season. Earlier in the season, right, they were below 500. They were outside of the play-in, looking in. Now they have climbed all the way up, tied, I think, for with the Memphis Grizzlies for second. They have the tiebreaker against the Grizzlies because they beat them in the last game they played. So now they're poised to kind of sit atop, one of those top spots in the Western Conference. So, what are we like in terms of what we've seen from the Mavs so far? Because this was a team that obviously went to the NBA Finals last season, lost in 5 to the Celtics, but they did represent the Western Conference after having a strong post-trade deadline stretch of the season. And we were kind of looking at this team as, it was going to be, could they make it back to the finals, right? Was that second stretch of the season legitimate, or was it just them getting hot, right? They also have some new pieces to work in. So there was also kind of that factor as well, right? But now, hey, they look about as good as anybody in the Western Conference so
Yeah.
far.
I think they've looked amazing. When we talked about them earlier in the season, I credited Kyrie for, what he's been able to do and be, locked in and efficient, and, they're just firing on all cylinders, like you said. And, offensively, they continue to do good stuff. Defensively, I think they're solid as well. And yeah, they're just kind of finding stuff where I think, we knew that they had it, but like you said at the beginning of the season, it wasn't really showing. But, now you're getting more things from these role players, which I think was a big issue. And once again, it's the trickle down effect because Luka had a interesting start to the season, but it has looked a lot better, and it's definitely translating in the win column area, and that's what you need because I think if he kind of coasts and like doesn't take the regular season seriously, then I think you're gonna have a problem and you're gonna run into probably some bad days in the postseason. But if he continues to play like this and continuously get better, while everybody else is efficient and gives you everything that you need from the role players, then I think they have a shot at going back to the NBA Finals. But we'll see.
Yeah, it's even with Klay Thompson, kind of just putting up. I don't want to say like pedestrian numbers, right? But just kind of just like another guy in the system kind of numbers, right? He's giving them like 13 a game, 3.5 rebounds, only 39% from the field,
Yeah.
36% from three. So, again, the last couple of games he shot better, but like also at the same time, like in some of these games, they're not quite as reliant on him. And I know he had like a stretch where he missed some time due to a foot issue. But like saying that win over Memphis, right? The comeback win, he only played 20 minutes. Um, and because he shot 1 for 5, and they were closing with other guys, right? Like they were closing like with Spencer Dinwiddie next to Kyrie, and Luca. And that's kind of something that we kind of talked about and discussed in the offseason when they signed him, is that unlike with Golden State, you're not as reliant on Klay Thompson as you were, or as Golden State was, right? So you're kind of in a position where if he's not playing well, you can sit him. Not that that sounds great, but like, it's not like before where like you feel kind of compelled to play him 30 plus minutes. Now you don't have to, and they have the depth pieces behind him where again, if he does have an off night, then you can kind of just slide somebody else in there. And again, like most of the pieces that they've acquired, like the non-Clay pieces have actually played really well,
Yeah.
right? Like again, Quentin Grimes, Najee Marshall, right? Like I mean, this team looks really good. I mean, if you even want to talk about like some of these advanced stats, I mean, I guess if you're talking about over the course of the entire season, right? There's some good numbers in there, right? Because like if you look at their offensive rating, they're fourth. If you look at their defensive rating, they're eighth, and that's across the entire season. So that even includes the stretch of time where they weren't playing very well, right? But in the last 10 games, right, where they're 9-1, they're second in offensive rating, right, and they're seventh in defensive rating. So there's a lot. And again, like you mentioned with Luca, right? That was also with him getting off to a slow start to begin the season.
Yeah.
Because that was my MVP pick to go into the season, and one really looking good. Still isn't looking great, although some of that also has been because of how some other guys have played. But just in general, that's the guy where if he continues to have that superstar impact, right, then he'll be able to kind of get him over the top. But these role players are also key as well, right? Because the key for the Mavs last season was their defense, in addition to having, two guys that can kind of carry you on the offensive end. But now they have a few more pieces I think that they can kind of turn to, for some possessions. And then even some of the guys that were already on the team, like PJ Washington, is having a great season defensively too. So, and I think part of that just comes from guys just being more comfortable. Now they've had an entire offseason and, this stretch of the regular season to kind of work together and figure things out. Jason Kidd also likes to experiment because I think that was part of it. Again, trying to figure out how to squeeze certain guys, into the rotation because they do have a number of players. Like this is a deep team, right? And that's kind of the cool part, right? Because like you don't want to be in a position where you have to rely on Klay Thompson to play well, or else you're kind of just cooked, right? You don't want to be in that spot because he's no longer, like an all NBA level guy anymore, right? He's no longer at that point in his career, but it's okay because you can slide all these other guys in. It was kind of weird because I think there was kind of discussions about like that they didn't sign Quentin Grimes to, an extension, and we'll see kind of where that goes in terms of, I guess that's probably like this upcoming offseason maybe, but just in general, which piece do you kind of, in terms of like, excluding Clay, because obviously that's, obviously the popular name, but which of these other guys has overall impressed you the most in terms of like who Dallas has picked up? Because, again, they made a decent number of moves, where a number of key guys, were kind of shipped out and replaced with these new ones.
Yeah, I mean, you could really go with a lot of them because I think as of late, they have played significantly better, and you're actually getting something out of them. But I think Quentin Grimes is probably one of them because I think it helps to have him out there a little bit more. I think than a guy like Jaden Hardy per se. Like you were kind of
Mhm.
relying on him for minutes like that, and I think when you have a guy who fits the mold a little bit better, 3 and D, and is really scrappy. I think that helps. And then obviously you have other guys that can do that role as well, just a little bit different in terms of like positions and stuff like that, like Najee Marshall, PJ Washington, like all those guys are scrappy players, 3 and D. But to have it at the guard position definitely helps, when Clay is kind of just out there and kind of just provides like I don't want to say like a facade, but it's really for floor spacing, and it's not really for like crazy impact or anything like that. So to have him out there definitely does help, and I think that's been my favorite pickup.
Point like that you meant, I like the word that you use, scrappy, right? Where it's just a number of guys that are going to fight and going to play hard and hustle.
Yeah,
And I think those are the type of guys that make sense to put next to Luka and Kyrie, right? Because we had that discussion when we were talking about the Lakers, right, in the last episode, where there's a lot of guys, on the roster that weren't two-way guys that don't necessarily always kind of scrap, for loose balls and fight for, to make sure that you don't give up offensive rebounds. But with the Mavs, you are seeing that. And that's, kind of the key thing in terms of putting the right types of pieces around your two stars where, because your two stars kind of provide the vast majority of what you need your team to do, right? And then obviously the rest of it is handled by your role players who also play very important parts, right? Because those are the guys that can kind of also swing individual games and moments and things like that. So, again, overall, really good basketball from the Dallas Mavericks. And, we'll see if they can pull it off again because obviously the Western Conference is still very deep in terms of there's a number of solid teams in there, but they have kind of seemingly played a cut above the rest so far, I think. Outside of I guess like OKC, and Memphis has also played very well too.
yeah,
And then also Minnesota, yeah, the Minnesota Timberwolves also kind of wanted to point them out. Right, they've now won 4 in a row, 6 of their last 10. Overall, look a lot better, I think, than they did during that stretch where they were looking pretty horrible, especially on the defensive end. That's kind of the part that I think has been the major turnaround the last few games that they've played. If you've watched them, um, when you look at their numbers, right, the last game they just played against the Golden State Warriors, not the one that they're playing uh, on Sunday, but the one before that, right? The one that they played Friday, right, or whatever. They held the Golden State Warriors to 90 points, right? So obviously that's a pretty good performance there, right? You like to see that. Just because of the fact that their defense was significantly worse so far this season. It was kind of slightly above average, but they were the number one defense the year before, right? Obviously. So 90 points. Then they also held both the Clippers and the Lakers the 2 games prior to 80 points, right? Held the Clippers before that to 92. And, again, overall, really high level play from them. Some of it is weird because, like, in some of these games, when you watch them, like, it still feels, I don't know, kind of odd. But at the same time, just in general, like, you have the part of Edwards playing really well. A couple of those games he didn't shoot well, right? But you were still getting, I think, overall, solid play. And then I think the other key is some of the role players I think, are kind of providing a much better impact on both ends of the floor, right? Like McDaniels has given you some better play. Gobert, who wasn't really bad, but like, I think, he seemingly has kind of picked up his level of play. Randall overall, he's provided a decent impact as well. And some of the other role players off the bench, I think, and Mike Conley, that's kind of the other key because there was a stretch where he missed some time, and that may just be part of it as well, where like Conley's just kind of a stabilizer out there, and when he doesn't play well, they don't really have anybody else who really fits that role. Because like DiVincenzo's not, even though he can play make a little bit, he's not really a point guard. And then Dillingham obviously is a rookie, and so he just doesn't even really play a whole lot unless guys are out. But just in general, they do look better, right? Because I think the last time we talked about them, we were kind of getting ready to start writing them off. Not that like Not that we expected them to even at the best version win the title this year anyways, but just it was starting to look really bad. But now it seems like they've kind of gotten under, they've kind of gotten things under control. Obviously, there's still a lot of there's still a lot of time in the NBA season left, but now they're seventh in the Western Conference with plenty of time to, continue to climb up, right? Because they're not that far behind any of these other teams. And as some of these other teams seemingly have kind of started to fall off, right? Teams that we've mentioned, teams like, say, Golden State, teams like the Lakers, even, say, Phoenix because of the injuries, right? It seems like some of, the teams that we kind of expected to be better are starting to kind of round into form because a couple of them did get off to really slow starts. Like Dallas got off to a slow start, but now Minnesota seemingly has kind of gotten things back under control. Which, again, when your best player calls out the team, that's kind of a good thing that they've started to look, a lot better, right? Because what would have been worse is if they looked the same, or if they, worst case scenario, just started to fall apart.
Yeah, I think with Minnesota, it's really not rocket science. I think you need Anthony Edwards to be doing what he does on both ends of the floor and playing at the level that he does, and you need Julius Randle to be a competent number two, and everyone else just needs to fill in defensively. So that's where I've kind of been lost on why it has looked that way. But granted, team chemistry is definitely a thing, and it has looked better, like you said, as of late. Guys are definitely, fitting into their roles a little bit better. And I think as the season goes on, I hope and pray that they do continue to look the part and, continue to win these good games and look better defensively because that was their identity. Like we knew that their defense was amazing. It's just we never knew what they were going to look like on the offensive end because they were so
Right.
volatile. But now it's been really the inverse. From a couple of guys. So I'm glad that they are figuring it out. And, depth should be one of their strong suits. And I hope that gets better as, the season goes on as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the key there is that it does feel like that they miss another guy still, right? Whereas it feels like they do need one more connecting piece that can kind of make some of these things work, whether or not, that's like, say, like a Kyle Anderson was on the team last year, right? And he's not there. Obviously, he's in Golden State. I guess, yeah, because he's getting more money than he was before, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's part of that. They signed Joe Ingles, I guess, as a veteran locker room guy, right? But he's not really playing anymore like he was earlier in the season. So, that's part of it. They've kind of found some other smaller lineups, right? Where like now you see like, Edwards maybe out there with like Alexander Walker and DiVincenzo, right? And like those are still sizable guards, right? But they're kind of figuring some of this stuff out. But I still feel like at the deadline, they'll need to kind of probably acquire an additional piece just because of the fact that they do look better. But I still kind of worry, like at times, like come postseason time, that some of it will kind of not look quite as smooth, right? I think there'll be like a little bit more clunkiness just because of how the postseason normally is. Obviously, you have the Edwards factor, so that's kind of an equalizer, kind of to balance some of that out. But it still feels like they do need more. But at the very least, it's nice to see that this team actually does have a pulse and isn't just like completely toast, like it was starting to look like earlier in the season, right? Because which
Yeah.
is it's kind of funny in the last 10 games. Offensive rating 18th, defensive rating 5th. So kind of flipped, right, from what we were seeing earlier in the season, right? Where like the offense was looking good, but the defense was looking, you know, pretty bad, right? And then obviously like if you're talking about the last 5 games, yeah, I'm not even gonna really go over that, because obviously it's a small sample size, but yeah, just like in general, um, it's good to see the improved play. But it is kind of weird because like there were a couple of games in those wins where it still felt like is the other team just playing like just really awful more so than Minnesota's playing good? Like and maybe that's part of it, but just in general, like I still give credit to them for figuring out, ways to turn the season around. It's just again, I need to see more. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's fair because for the first 15 games or so, it wasn't looking good. So
Yeah.
now let's see if they can kind of go not just like say a good stretch of 6, 7 games, but can we get like a good stretch of like 15 games? Can we get that going? And that's where I think I'll feel better about this team compared to how I was feeling earlier in the season.
Yeah. We just need more consistency. I think that's the key.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Now time to talk about some news and rumors. So we'll start with some negative things. Unfortunately, we got a couple of injuries that we're gonna have to talk about. We'll start with Franz Wagner, right? Because that one happened a couple days ago. So unfortunately, it looks like he's gonna be out for at least 4 weeks with a torn oblique, which is basically the same injury that Paolo had. So that's just absolutely brutal that your two best players have basically the same injury in the same season. Obviously, Paolo was out a little while ago. He's still out, and I don't think there's like a clear timetable in terms of like, how far are we from him coming back, right? Like I think Paolo said he hopes to be back maybe by around Christmas, but we don't know for sure yet. So he's still going to be out at least for a little while. And then obviously for Franz, he's going to be out at least for a month, right?
Yeah.
So that means that there's going to be at least a stretch of presumably at least a couple of weeks, right? Where there's going to be no Franz, no Paolo, and those guys were basically playing like all stars. So that's an absolutely brutal situation to be in. I guess if you want any remotely positive thing, which is really kind of stretching it, they are 7 games above 500. Because of the fact that before Franz went out, they were playing great, so they have a little bit of a cushion. But the problem is that again, they're the third in the East right now, but the Milwaukee Bucks only have two more losses than the Orlando Magic, right? So, the problem is that if the Magic start losing like 3, 4, 5 in a row, and then the other teams below them start kind of going on runs a little bit more, like again, the Hawks have already won 6 in a row, 7 of their last 10. You presume they'll probably still find ways to win games. We'll see. But that's the problem is that if they start losing a bunch of games consecutively, they're going to drop from the third spot. And you expect them to anyways without their two best players. It's just like I said, I guess you could make the case that they have a little bit of a cushion, but they need one of those guys. They need Paolo hopefully to come back sooner rather than later. Because if he can come back and give them anything close to what he was giving them earlier in the season, they could at least probably stay afloat. But without both of them, this is going to be a really, really rough stretch.
Yeah, I'm super like concerned with the fact that they both have the same injury. That's the
Hmm.
weird part where it's like that torn oblique thing. But it's a devastating blow. Like for for Orlando Magic fans, you can't catch a break because this could have been their
Right.
year where it's like, you know,
Yeah.
that team could have really broken out and done some damage. But I don't know. That's kind of going to be rough to overcome. Because that recovery is going to be something to watch as well because guys aren't might not just come back and play at the level that they were.
Right.
They're gonna have to ramp up, and you're not gonna have them at the same time potentially either. So that's another thing. And how far will they fall? I think that's the probably the biggest concern that a lot of these Magic fans have right now. It really sucks.
Exactly. And again, like I don't there's not a whole lot you can do cuz ideally you need at least one of those guys if you want to try to find ways to win games, but just they're not going to have them for a while. So I just
Yeah.
they're currently playing the Phoenix Suns right now, and they're battling. So and the thing is like defensively, they should still probably be pretty good. It's just the problem is I don't really know how they're going to be able to get too much offense going.
Yeah.
Just because, you're going to have to find ways to get some of these guys to step up, on the offensive end. I mean, because, you look at the starting five against the Suns, it's Jalen Suggs, KCP, Tristan Da Silva, Wendell Carter Jr., and Goga Batazde, right? Like, so somebody presumably either somebody in the starting five, and then definitely somebody off the bench is going to have to kind of give them some type of offensive boost. We'll see what they do. I mean, if they can actually like find a way to even stay 500 during the stretch, that would be like absolutely
Yeah.
remarkable.
Right.
I don't know if they can do it because I mean, like if you've seen their schedule, it's a very tough stretch of games coming up for them where I just don't really know how they're going to be able to hang on unless, like I said, you just get some crazy play from some of these guys. I mean, you look at their schedule. They're like I said, they're playing the Phoenix Suns as we speak, and then after that, they play the Milwaukee Bucks, the Oklahoma City Thunder, Miami twice, the Celtics, the Knicks. I mean, like so from here to the end of the month, it's a lot of really difficult matchups. The beginning of January, it does kind of ease up, and then once you get to middle, after the first week of January, then again Knicks, Wolves, Bucks, Sixers, Celtics, Nuggets. Just a lot of tough matchups. So I just don't really know how they're going to be able to hang on unless, they just shut teams down on the defensive end. I just think, and like, I just also don't think that's realistic. If they do, I will be pleasantly surprised and very shocked, but I just don't really know how they're going to be able to do it. Luckily, the East, again, is not amazing. So, like, you could, in theory, fall, which is kind of what happened last season, right? Like, they started this year off pretty well. Then they had some injuries and they dropped. Then they kind of closed the year strong. It's just rough because your two best players both will have missed at least a month's time, which, I don't think was the case last season, right? Like, both of those guys, by and large, were relatively healthy, if I'm not mistaken. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the tough part there, but I mean, any team in that situation you know, any team in that situation would be struggling. Like Paolo played
Yes.
in 80 games last season, right? So
Yes.
you're talking about he literally only missed 2 games last season, right?
Yeah.
Franz Wagner, how many games did he play? He played 72. So both of those guys both played over 70 games, and now both of those guys are gonna miss at least 10, right? 15, so something like that. And again, those guys, if they were healthy, they would basically be for sure all-stars essentially. Like at this point, right? So, but it doesn't seem like it was meant to be. But
Yeah. It's
hopefully
rough.
we'll see if they can find some way to bounce back. But then we also had another injury. Brandon Ingram, right? Popular trade target as of right now, right? He went down, kind of a freak injury, right? I think, he got kind of knocked into by Lou Dort and he got an ankle sprain. And he's kind of had a history of like these really like just bad luck type of injuries, right? Like I know he's an injury prone guy, but it tends to be like a lot of like just awkward situations. But, again, people don't really view it that way. I think he's just viewed as an injury prone guy. But it's brutal, right? It's a high grade, low left ankle sprain, and they don't know how long he's going to be out. But it's assumed, right, that he's going to be out for at least a while because he's out indefinitely. And it's right after, all this talk about Ingram, stuff like him wanting to be in a winning competitive environment, right? Possibly him maybe taking a short term deal, right? With another team, or, if he stays in New Orleans, I guess the Pelicans. And now I don't know, right? Because obviously now that he's hurt, right, I would imagine that would kind of lower the likelihood, at least as of right now, that he gets moved because you would want to wait until he's able to actually play, unless you're a team that doesn't immediately right now care about, wins, I guess. But it's rough, right? Because for New Orleans, again, this continues to be an absolutely nightmarish season, right? Where once again, your two best players are not healthy and not available, and then even guys that you acquired have not been healthy and have not been available. So I wonder, does this put a wrench in the possible outcome of him getting moved? Right? Could he still get moved down the line? Yeah, because I mean the trade deadline isn't until February, if he even gets traded at all. But this situation continues to become even murkier, right? Because obviously, like now, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult to find a deal for him because obviously whoever's trading for him is going to have to wait for him to be available. Like you can make trades with injured players. This isn't 2K, but it's just obviously like ideally if you trade for him, you'd like for him to be available as soon as possible, not be in a position where you have to wait multiple weeks potentially for him to come. And we don't know the timeline yet, so we'll still have to wait. But do you think this kind of changes the trade possibilities for Brandon Ingram? Or is it just like, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. It's just, it's kind of the same situation.
I think it's the same. I don't think this changes anything. I think, um, what is the market for him? That's what I'm kind of concerned with
Right.
because I know that we've had multiple teams already kind of come out and deny the fact that they want him. So that kind of nips that in the bud, I guess. But take that with a grain of salt if you want. So that's really my question. What is the market? Because if there wasn't a market before, I don't think there's going to be a market after post injury. I don't think that really helps.
Yeah, and that's the tough part is that we don't know the market, right? We don't know what the Pelicans are necessarily looking for in exchange for Brandon Ingram. We don't know what teams are willing to, pay in order to re-sign him. There's still a lot that we don't really quite know as of yet. So,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the thing where again, we've acknowledged multiple times, good player, talented player, but in some cases might be a little bit tough to fit on some of these teams. And also you have the factor that you're going to have to pay him a lot of money, and he's also an injury prone guy. So, and in this new CBA, we're kind of seeing that like some of these teams aren't necessarily just going to pay for guys just because, right? Like we saw with the Clippers, right, where they just let Paul George go, right? Where like, he had a pretty good season, but they still didn't really want to pay him to keep him around because it was more beneficial for them to let him go, and they had, more financial control over their team in terms of the flexibility and the moves they could pull off. And with New Orleans, you know, he's not in the same position as Paul George because he's obviously a younger player. But, New Orleans has been in the same spot pretty much every year where their team has disappointed because their core guys just haven't been able to put enough of a stretch together in terms of health and production. So, again, like if you're a team, that I guess, is looking at a talent upgrade, it's not a problem. It's just a matter of, again, is it the right move? Like, say, I'm just kind of spitballing just because people have talked about it. Like, say, if you're the Lakers, right? Like, that's a talent upgrade, but is it actually, in theory, like the right move that you should pull off if you're the Lakers? Obviously, you could factor in, okay, you're getting close to the end of the LeBron AD era, so you just have a star that, regardless of what happens, maybe he's the guy after LeBron that plays with AD, or maybe he's the guy you build around. I don't know. Say for a team like Golden State, right? Is that the guy that you go after, knowing that he's not like your typical Golden State fit? That's and also like again, do you want to pay him however much he's looking for, right? Because that's the question there. So I don't know. It's kind of hard to just continue to say, I don't know. I'm just not sure about this situation, right? Where I feel like this could go either way. Like it
Yeah.
wouldn't surprise me if he got moved and a team traded for him kind of at the last minute, but it also wouldn't surprise me if like nobody traded for him and then New Orleans kind of has to re-sign him unless he just walks or it's a sign and trade, but you know, it, teams may not do that anymore, so
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody really knows what's going on at this point.
right. Yeah, it's definitely kind of an unpredictable situation, I think. Whereas, like,
Yeah.
there are some other times where, like, we kind of knew what was going on,
Yeah.
right? Like, we knew, like, say, when Durant requested to be traded from Brooklyn, like, we knew at some point he was going to get moved. I think it was a little bit more surprising at the length of time it took. But at a certain point, you kind of figured, like, star requests a trade. Usually they're going to get moved, right? That hasn't quite been the case with Ingram. Obviously, he's not in the same tier as Durant, but this one makes it a little bit tougher.
Yeah.
Um, after that, according to Mark Stein, Nuggets eager to enter trade market just had a crazy game against the Wizards in which, yes, there was no Jamal Murray, and no Aaron Gordon, but they're also playing the Wizards, who were also missing some guys. They lost despite Jokic giving you almost 60 points.
Hmm.
Um, and I think we kind of already know, like, the Nuggets need additional pieces. It does say, he's kind of specifically mentioned Zeke Naji, draft picks, which is kind of all they have, right? Like, I mean, you're not really going to give up any of the key guys in the rotation. You're not giving up any of the starters. You're probably not giving up guys like, say, like a Peyton Watson, or anything like that. So, I mean, that's kind of all you really have, and that's not a whole lot. Obviously, with Najee, his contract is more than what you would think, right? Which again is kind of wild because you rarely ever see him play, and that's because he's not really that great and doesn't really fit, I think, what Denver was looking for. Like they were looking for more of like a typical backup five, but he's kind of more like a four. But also, like I don't even really know if he's even really. I guess he's just not that good because he doesn't play, even though they don't have a backup center other than DeAndre Jordan. But you look at his contract, and he's making basically right around 9 million this season. So that's a guy that maybe you move him, attach one of those useless guys that don't really play, you know, and then maybe like a pick or something like that. You could pick up like a $9-10 million player. I don't really know, um, like specifically, like they haven't mentioned like specific names, but just in terms of the player, a type of player that they need, anybody who can come off the bench that has a pulse, I feel like is probably a reasonable pick for them, right? It could be like a guy who comes off the bench as like a scorer. I mean, like Westbrook has the ball in his hands. So like presumably a guy who can play off of guys like Jokic and Westbrook who can, catch and shoot, but also like defend but also just kind of be a guy that can heat up and give you some offense, just because of the fact that when Jokic is off the floor, they they just completely just bleed possessions where, like, I mean, there are games where like the Nuggets still manage to win, barely eke it out, but then Jokic has like a double digit plus minus where it's like a 4 point win against the Warriors where he has a plus minus a plus 23. Because when he's out there, they're actually playing pretty well. But when he's not out there, it's off. And like there are some times where like he's in there and they're just not that good. So like they still lose anyways. Like against the Cavs, they just got whooped. Like because they're not really that great. Look at the record, look at the way they played. Part of that's Jamal Murray, part of that's the bench, part of that's just, whatever. But either way, we know they need upgrades. I'm sure they know they need upgrades. Otherwise, we wouldn't be hearing this. It's just a matter of what can they actually realistically get, and is that enough to possibly turn, this season around?
Yeah, I'd take anything I could get if I was Denver. Like, the doors are open. Like, you need to figure out something. Get somebody somewhere, put them on the bench and hope and pray that they can do something, because it's really, really freaking bad.
Yeah, the word used was Nuggets eager to shake
Yeah.
things up,
Yeah. I haven't heard
and
that one in a while,
yeah,
if
so
ever.
that yeah, so that kind of already lets you know, like, they know and understand, like, yeah, this isn't working. Which again, we had concern, even though we kind of had them as a dark horse, we just didn't feel confident enough to really put them right in the, we didn't feel comfortable enough to pick them to actually come out of the West because of the fact that, hey, they have a very limited bench and it feels like they got worse. We don't know about Jamal Murray. And so far, that's kind of what's been playing out so far, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
Jamal Murray has not had a great season. The bench has not had a great season. They usually don't, anyways, but like it's been particularly bad this season. And that's with like a couple of bright spots, like some of the young guys playing well, but they need more, right? Like they've just lost a number of solid role players since the title year. Some of that, like, you just couldn't really overcome. Like there was nothing you could do about losing Bruce Brown. But, like just in general, like they need more. And,
Yeah.
and again, that's not a shocker. That's not a hot take. Like that's just reality, right? Like, I mean, and we'll see if the Nuggets actually kind of do something. Because there's been talk about like, that you can't waste this Jokic season and stuff like that. So you gotta do something.
Yeah.
And then finally, last but not least, according to Shams, the Warriors want a star with Curry. Again, is this really a hot take? Is this really a shocker? Warriors on real hunt for star to pair with Stephen Curry. I'm told that the Warriors are on the real hunt for a star, a playmaker, a scorer. Again, this is the type of stuff we've been talking about where with the Warriors, they had a nice run. They played well to begin the season. But at a certain point, you knew it probably wasn't going to be completely sustainable. I think we both talked about the idea that I think we were wrong about how bad they were going to be. But I think we're still kind of on point in terms of like the ceiling still isn't super high. Like it's not championship level high. It clearly wasn't as high as it was in the season. And like we talked about it, where it kind of was a little bit more of a regular season team just because of the fact that they do have depth, they do have a lot of defense. But now the depth guys haven't played as well recently. Steph hasn't unfortunately played as well recently. He's also been hurt. Now there's kind of been talk about Draymond coming off the bench with Jonathan Kuminga starting. Kind of interesting. Maybe that drives up his trade value. I don't really know. But they've been on a slide, 3-7 in their last 10, so they have to shake up something. But I think everybody knows and understands what they actually have to do. They have to actually find a legitimate second option to pair next to Steph, and still have Draymond on the team and kind of go from there, right? Because I still don't think, regardless, they're probably going to win the title. But at least you'd have a better shot than what you have right now. Because right now, like, your team's kind of just stuck in limbo where you can win games, but you're not actually going to go anywhere. And, you don't really want to be in that position when you have Steph. And, again, some of these other guys are kind of getting hurt and banged up too. And, even the young guys that they've kind of been building up have been pretty inconsistent, right? Like Kuminga had like a 33-point game, like a career game against the Rockets. Then he plays against Minnesota, kind of back to his previous role, coming off the bench as a spark plug, and then sparks the other team going on a run essentially. So, and then say like with the Brandon Pajemski had a great rookie season, not so good this season, right? To the point where Steve Kerr, after the loss to the Nuggets, called him out. And then Trace Jackson Davis, the worst layup percentage, one of the worst layup percentages in the league. At one point, it was Bam, where he had like the worst layup percentage in the league, which was crazy. But obviously his field goal percentage is still pretty high because of the dunks and whatnot, because that's most of his offense. But it just feels like you're just not getting a lot of great production out of your young players. Some of the veteran guys, like a Draymond, like a Wiggins, even Kevon Looney have played pretty well. But we talked about it. Like, they just don't have enough. Buddy Hield came off the bench, had a great hot start to the season. Now he's kind of cooled off. Now the bench doesn't look as good. So they need help. They need pieces, which we already knew. Nothing really shocking here. It's
Yeah,
just a matter of, like,
yeah,
who can they actually get?
yeah. I mean, like, it's not. I don't think this is really like news to anyone. I think every team is probably in the market for a star, but how many are willingly, going to accept being traded? How many teams are willing to let go of a star? Because what kind of package can you really give? Because I think every single young guy who is on the Golden State Warriors, their value is probably at an all-time low, in my opinion. So I don't think it's feasible. I think they might be stuck with this roster unless they pull off some like weird trade involving like some future picks or something and like a crazy haul of young guys for a mediocre star, in my opinion. I think that's the best that they could probably do.
Yeah, and they supposedly, right, have kind of ruled out guys like a Zach Levine, and a Brandon Ingram.
Well,
So,
that's all
we'll
who's
see.
available.
Yeah, and that's the thing where it's like I'm kind of curious to see who else is available. Like, who do they kind of look at as an actual star? Because say like a Giannis, he seems off the table now because the Bucks have been playing better. And
Yeah.
then you kind of look around and it's like I don't really see off the top of my head like anyone like maybe it's like, oh, let's go get Vucevic, as a center. It's like, okay. I mean, he's had a great season for Chicago, but I don't know how sustainable. I mean, like, he's been playing really well. It's just like I don't know if that's actually who he is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that I just. But again, a lot of that type of stuff that's the type of thing that we talked about going into the season. So again, kind of a shocker that, like, okay, so and so had certain issues to go into the season. 20 games in, those are the issues, right? Like, it's the same with the Lakers, right? It was like the same roster as it was last year. Surprise, surprise. It's the same issues that they were having last year.
Yeah.
So, and again, there's not a whole lot you can do early in the season, anyways, just because of the fact that you can't really trade a lot of guys if teams sign guys in the offseason, you can't trade them until December, mid-December, anyways. Like, say, a guy like a D'Anthony Melton, if you wanted to include him in a trade, you can't trade him for another week just because, they sign him in the offseason. Guy like a Jonas Valanciunas on the Wizards, right? He can't be traded until mid-December, right? Because he signed a contract in the offseason. So once you get to late December, that's probably where you'll actually hear more feasible talks pick up. Doesn't mean actual moves will happen, but, that's kind of where you'll get to a point where, there's actually more legal things that can occur.
Yes.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in terms of all the teams we talked about, right? Like the Boston Celtics, Dallas Mavericks, Atlanta Hawks, Minnesota Timberwolves. Let us know, obviously, because it's a long NBA season, and we love obviously answering comments about things. The NBA Cup heating up, right? We're getting closer and closer to the last few rounds, right? Obviously, right? The knockout round is pretty much over. We'll obviously talk about that as that's occurred. We'll continue to update everyone on that. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And we appreciate all the support. We'll see you in the next video.